This is my presentation about the shrinking glaciers in Wyoming's Teton Mountain Range. Whenever I travel between Grand Teton National Park and the town of Jackson, I drive past the Teton Range and occasionally pull into the turnouts to fully take in the views. I remember seeing a sign at the Glacier View turnout talking about shrinking glaciers and decided to return to fully internalize the message that sign is trying to get across. Since I visited in November after some large snowstorms, the Tetons were pretty well covered in snow, so the shrinking glaciers wasn't very obvious. However, I also took some pictures of the range along that same road last month before the snow started falling, and the shrinking is fairly obvious as the remaining glaciers look pretty minuscule. After taking it all in, I wanted to learn more, so I dove into a report from NPS that goes into greater detail about these glaciers. The shrinking glacier sign points out to viewers where the major remaining glaciers in the range are, and then goes on to explain how the glaciers have lost 25% of their total surface area over the past 50 years due to climate change. It then goes on to explain how these glaciers can increase and decrease in size over time with the temperature and levels of precipitation, but that the overall trend of them shrinking poses a problem to the wildlife, recreational activities, and crop irrigation that water runoff from those glaciers provides. The NPS report digs in deeper by explaining that the shrinking features of the range were formed by glaciers during the Ice Age, but that the original glaciers disappeared 10,000 years ago, and that the smaller high-alpine glaciers that we see today were formed during the Little Ice Age from 1400 to 1850. It explains that the scientists are now tracking the size of those glaciers via ground and aerial photos taken over the past 90 years, and have been taking GPS measurements since 2014. The scientists tracking this change have realized that as climate change progresses, these glaciers will eventually disappear. In fact, we're already seeing this happen as they've watched TP Glacier become inactive over just the past few years. In fact, photos from 2016 show that it was still very much active then, back in 2016. And TP Glacier is one of the small glaciers, but it's a glimpse into the future of the other glaciers if global warming doesn't stop. When the topic of climate change comes up, the first thing that I think of is polar bears and the melting glaciers in the Arctic. Melting glaciers in the High-alpine in the US is not something that has ever come to mind for me personally, but this site visit and corresponding report have made me realize how important it is. As soon as I was made aware of glacial melting, my first thought was how it would impact the local environment and wildlife. After all, the mountains are a haven for wildlife, and they depend on the water these glaciers provide during the summer. Some melting during the summer is important to ensure this glacial runoff, but as the glaciers are being diminished more during the summer than they are being replenished during the winter, it poses a huge problem in the near future. What didn't immediately come to mind was the impact that melting glaciers have on tourism. The glaciers help provide opportunity for early summer skiing and also provide a more challenging and exciting environment for tourists looking for a true mountaineering experience. My favorite mountaineering experience was having to use crampons and an ice axe to summit the Middle Teton, and then being able to descend the mountain in a quick and exciting way by glissading. It would be incredibly sad to me personally and also potentially devastating to local tourism if this is no longer an option in the future. The runoff of these glaciers also helps fill up the Snake River to provide more intense and exciting experiences on the river. And let's not forget about the view. My favorite view of the Tetons is when they are covered in snow, and the glaciers help provide some of this look during the summer months as well. If the glaciers completely disappear, the mountains will look bare and not as beautiful, which also has the potential to hurt tourism and thus the local economy. The interpretation sign at Glacier View Turnout is targeted at the typical tourist who stops by to take in the stunning views of the Tetons, with the goal of informing them that one of the destructive impacts of climate change is happening right in front of them. I'm incredibly happy that this fact is being shared with the world, but I'm sad that this is an issue in the first place and do not believe that the sign is impactful enough. I believe it could have been more impactful if the sign would have showed what the glacier used to look like so that tourists can compare it to what they now see before them. Without a before picture, there is nothing to reference. It also would have been more impactful to provide a QR code that links to a page with additional information on the topic, possibly the NPS report that I read, as well as information on what the average person can do to help stop the melting, or organizations that they can donate to that are fighting climate change. Nonetheless, I found the experience to be insightful and interesting. As my presentation draws to a close, I'd like to leave you with two questions to ponder. One, do you believe the average tourist is left with a greater understanding of the threat of climate change through education of environmental impacts, or by diminished views and recreational experiences? And two, do you believe it is better for interpretation science to provide short summaries that are more likely to be read, or in-depth information that will be more impactful and informative for those who take the time to read it? Thank you for listening to my presentation. I hope you enjoyed and learned something. And remember, never stop saving the world.